4 days after giving birth to our fourth daughter, I came home expecting to recover. Instead, my husband threw divorce papers at me and said, "Get out, take your daughters, I need a son." His mother laughed behind him. I didn't beg or argue. I said 4 words that wiped the smiles off their faces. But neither of them noticed the camera recording everything. What would that video expose? 4 days after my C-section, I came home carrying our fourth daughter in an infant carrier. My hospital bracelet was still around my wrist. Every step pulled at the incision, and even coughing hurt. I expected quiet. Instead, my husband was standing in the living room with his mother beside him. He did not ask how I felt. He did not look at the baby. He picked up a stack of papers and threw them toward me. Several pages struck my chest. The rest slid across the hardwood floor. Divorce papers. There were proposed temporary orders underneath them too. Get out. Take your daughters. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. Then he said there was no room in that house for a woman who could not give him a son. His mother laughed. Not nervously, not because she misunderstood. She laughed like she had been waiting for that moment. For a second, I heard only the refrigerator running and the small click of the infant carrier shifting against my hand. My fingers were trembling. The incision burned. I wanted to cry. I wanted to ask how a man who had watched me carry 4 children could look at me 4 days after surgery and speak as if I had failed some test. Then I saw 3 pairs of little shoes beside the staircase. My older girls were upstairs. If I fell apart in that room, they might remember it for the rest of their lives. So I looked at my husband. "Are you finished?" He stared at me. I think he mistook my quiet for surrender. People do that sometimes. They assume silence means weakness because it never occurs to them that the quiet person may be watching, remembering, and deciding what matters. I tightened my hand around the carrier. Then I said 4 words. "The house is mine." His mother stopped laughing. My husband asked what I was talking about. I gave him only what he needed to hear. My father's trust had bought the house. There had never been a mortgage. His name was not on the deed. He told me that was impossible. I did not argue. "Call your attorney." That was all. I was still shaking. I was still in pain. I had no idea what the next week would bring. As I moved toward the foyer, something above the front door caught my eye. The security camera. A green light was blinking. It had been there the entire time. It had heard the papers hit the floor. It had heard him tell me to take our daughters. It had heard his mother laugh. I did not know yet how important that recording would become, but to understand why my husband believed he could throw 5 of us out of a house that had never belonged to him, I have to go back years to when I still believed the disappointment on his face was only a phase. It started with our first daughter. When she was born, I still believed love could smooth over almost anything. My husband cried when the nurse placed her in his arms. He took pictures and stood beside the hospital nursery window, amazed by someone so small. Then his mother came in. She leaned over the bassinet and said, "Well, maybe the next one will be Grant's boy." She said it lightly. That was what made it sting. I told myself she was from another generation. Keeping the peace felt easier than admitting how much one sentence could stay with me. 2 years later, our second daughter was born. By then, the comments were familiar. "You're still young. There's plenty of time." Maybe 3rd time's the charm. They showed up at Sunday lunch, at church potlucks, even while we were choosing a family Christmas card. My husband rarely joined in. For a long time, I mistook that for support. When his mother made one of those remarks, he looked down or changed the subject. I told myself he hated confrontation. Years later, I understood something I had not wanted to see. Silence is not always neutral. Sometimes people stay quiet because the side causing the hurt is more convenient. Our girls became more themselves every year. Our oldest sat in the back seat after preschool pickup with a book in her lap, sounding out words all the way home. Our second asked, why, about everything. Why birds sat on power lines. Why pancakes had bubbles. Why grown-ups said things they did not mean. Our third hummed before she could finish full sentences. Every scrap of paper became a drawing. To me, they were three different little people. To his mother, they still added up to one thing, not a boy. By the time our third daughter was born, my husband had changed too. He held her for a few minutes before handing her back to the nurse. There were fewer pictures. No excited calls. I explained that away too. He was tired. Work was hard. He would come around. One evening, after the girls were asleep, his mother asked whether we were really done trying. I waited for him to shut the question down. Instead, he said, "We'll see." That was the first time I understood the son she wanted was no longer just her obsession. For a long time, I thought that was the biggest problem in my marriage. I was wrong. While I was raising three little girls, my husband had started looking at everything I did, including my work, as if none of it was worth his attention. He called it my little bookkeeping thing. It started with a friend who owned a small clothing store outside Columbus. She needed help cleaning up several months of receipts. At first, it was only a couple of hours each week. I reconciled bank statements, organized invoices, handled payroll questions, and fixed problems in QuickBooks for busy small business owners. My husband never took it seriously. Once, while I was working at the kitchen table after the girls were asleep, he glanced at my laptop and asked, "How's your little bookkeeping thing?" "Busy," I said. That was all. I had learned that explaining myself to someone who had already decided something was unimportant changed nothing. The work grew slowly. One client recommended another. Soon, I had a steady group of small business owners who trusted me with their books and payroll. I opened a business account. I sent invoices. I earned my own money. My husband never asked how much. He assumed it was spending money. The house was another subject he never cared enough to understand. After my father died, he left property and investments inside a trust for me. Years later, when we bought our home in the suburbs, the purchase money came directly from those assets. There was no mortgage. The deed was in my name. My husband knew my father had left what he called family money. He had seen my name on the paperwork. His answer was always the same. "We're married. It's ours anyway." I never argued. Looking back, the things he dismissed were quietly becoming the things that gave me choices. People often think financial independence begins the day someone decides to leave. Mine began years earlier, in quiet evenings after bedtime, when I was balancing someone else's books and had no idea I was building a life raft for myself. That spring, I stood alone in the bathroom holding a pregnancy test. 2 lines. 3 times before those lines had made me smile. This time, my first feeling was fear. Not of the baby, of the man sleeping in the next room. I hid the test in a drawer for 2 days before I told him. When I finally did, what chilled me was not what he said. It was what he didn't. When I finally told him, he did not smile. He did not hug me. He did not even ask how I felt. He looked at the pregnancy test on the bathroom counter, then back at me. When will they know? I knew exactly what he meant. When would they know if it was a boy? I told him it would be a while. He nodded once and left the room. That pregnancy felt different from the beginning. Not because the baby was different, because the house was. My husband started missing appointments he had always attended before. Sometimes he said work was too busy, other times he simply forgot. When the baby moved beneath my shirt, he no longer reached over to feel it. His phone began staying face down on the table. He worked later, The girls seemed louder to him than they had before. Ordinary things, a dropped spoon, an argument over crayons, too much laughter after dinner, could make him close his eyes like he was trying to escape the noise. His mother called often. She rarely asked how I was feeling. Instead, she would say, "Any news yet?" Everyone else treated the question like something harmless. One afternoon at the grocery store, a woman noticed my stomach while I was reaching for cereal. "Boy or girl?" She smiled when she asked. There was nothing cruel about it. Still, I felt my shoulders tighten. That was when I realized how much one ordinary question had changed inside me. For most families, it was curiosity. In mine, it had become a test. At 2 in the morning one night, heartburn kept me awake. I sat alone at the kitchen table eating crackers and waiting for my stomach to settle. My husband walked through on his way to the bathroom. He looked at me. Then he kept walking. He did not ask if I was all right. The bathroom door closed. I sat there listening to the refrigerator hum and understood something I had been avoiding for months. I had become part of the furniture in my own home, something he moved around instead of someone he moved toward. Some marriages do not break with one terrible moment. They weaken through hundreds of smaller ones, when one person slowly stops asking if the other is okay. When we finally learned the baby was another girl, my husband stared at the floor. Then he said, "I need some air." He left the house. A few hours later, his mother called. I heard. I had not told her. After I hung up, I sat with that small detail longer than I should have. I was beginning to understand that my husband and his mother were sharing more than I knew. What I did not know was that during those final weeks of my pregnancy, he was not simply pulling away from me. He was preparing for a life without me. By the last few weeks of my pregnancy, the small things were harder to ignore. My husband changed the passcode on his phone. He came home late more often. When certain calls came in, he stepped into the garage and closed the door. Once, I noticed a folder on the dining table. By morning, it was gone. His mother suddenly became very interested in my due date. I saw the signs. I just did not have the energy to follow everyone. When you are getting children to school, packing lunches, making appointments, and carrying another baby, warning signs do not always get missed because you are foolish. Sometimes you are simply too tired to chase every shadow. Then labor started. It did not go the way we expected. Hours later, under bright operating room lights, with my hands cold and my body trembling, our fourth daughter was delivered by emergency section. The first sound I heard was her cry. Then, a nurse told me she was healthy. When they placed her against me, I looked at her tiny face and chose the name Grace. I wanted her name to hold something gentle, something hopeful. My husband arrived about 40 minutes later. He stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at me, not at her. "Another girl?" I told him her name. He did not repeat it. He did not hold her or touch the blanket. He checked his phone twice. After a few minutes, he said his mother was waiting downstairs. Then he left. I watched the door close and looked down at my daughter. One of us had just been rejected. I was determined she would never grow up believing it was her fault. For the first time, I asked myself what I was still trying to save. If a man could look at his own baby, less than an hour old, and see disappointment, what was left for me to defend? Because of the surgery, the doctors kept me in the hospital for 4 days, standing hurt. On discharge morning, a nurse helped me pack because bending still pulled at the incision. My husband never came back. He did not video call. The only message he sent was about who would pick up the older girls. Even then, part of me kept making excuses. Maybe he was angry. Maybe we would talk when I got home. The nurse secured Grace in the carrier and helped me toward the exit. "I just want to go home," I said. Later, those words stayed with me. When the car turned into our driveway, my mother-in-law's vehicle was already there. Before I opened the front door, I knew something was waiting inside. When I opened the front door, the scene I had been dreading was already waiting for me. 4 days after surgery, I stepped inside with Grace in her carrier. Papers hit the floor. My husband told me to take our daughters and leave. I gave him 4 words. "The house is mine." For a second, he stared at me. Then he gave a short, nervous laugh. His mother shook her head. "That's ridiculous." I did not give them a speech. I told them 3 things. My father's trust had paid for the house. There had never been a mortgage. The deed was in my name. My husband said we had been married for years, so that made the house his too. I did not argue law with him. "Call your attorney." He went into the kitchen with his phone. His mother's tone changed almost immediately. Minutes earlier, she had been laughing while I stood there in pain with a newborn. Now she said, "Surely we could talk about this like adults." That stayed with me. People often become interested in being reasonable only after they realize they no longer control the outcome. I was not celebrating. My incision hurt. Grace needed to be fed. My older girls were upstairs, quiet in a way children should never have to be. Then I noticed the foyer camera. I opened the security app. The clip was still there. I watched a few seconds myself coming through the door. The papers falling. His voice, his mother's laugh. My first instinct was to send it to someone. Maybe my sister, maybe everyone. I stopped. There is a strange instinct now to turn pain into proof for the whole world. But sometimes the strongest evidence is the evidence you are disciplined enough not to turn into content. I called my father's former attorney. She listened, then told me exactly what to do. Save the original file. Don't edit it. Don't post it. Don't send it around. The next morning, she reviewed the divorce papers, the deed, and the trust records. She did not promise me everything. She said the title was in my name, the purchase funds could be traced to my father's trust, and that gave us a strong position. Then she kept reading. Finally, she looked up. Did he know that camera was recording? I don't think he remembered. She tapped one page. That may matter, because according to this, he's telling his attorney that you forced him out. I looked at my phone. The video was still there. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I did not feel afraid. I felt clear. If he wanted to build his divorce on a lie, I would not argue with him. I would let the evidence do that. I thought that was the worst lie he was willing to tell. By noon the next day, I learned it wasn't. My attorney told me not to argue with him, save every message, keep the camera file untouched, document every contact. She also told me to notify the school that no one should change the pickup list without confirmation. I did exactly that. A few hours later, the school office called. My mother-in-law was there, asking to take my 2 oldest girls. She said my husband had sent her. Then she told the secretary, their mother just had surgery. She isn't doing well emotionally. I heard her in the background. She's overwhelmed. Everyone knows women can be emotional after childbirth. I was sitting on the sofa with Grace against my chest. They were turning my recovery into an argument that I could not care for children I had raised for years. I did not yell. Please follow the pickup list already on file. Then I called my attorney. Some cruelty arrives, dressed as concern. People say they are helping, while quietly taking control. I was learning how dangerous that could be. A few hours later, my attorney called again. My husband had filed an emergency motion. He described me as unstable after childbirth, irrational, controlling, and determined to keep him from the girls. He claimed I had forced him out and asked the court to change the temporary parenting arrangement. That was when anger finally rose above fear. Not because of the house, not because of money, because he was using our daughters as leverage. My attorney gathered the foyer video, hospital instructions, pediatric records, the school report, his messages, and records showing I had long been the primary caregiver. The video showed who had said, "Take your daughters." It was not me. The court did not make an emergency custody change based only on his accusations. The girls stayed in their routine until the temporary hearing. Most communication moved to a co-parenting app, and pickup changes had to follow existing rules. It was the first time his plan failed. I was learning that strength sometimes means saving the truth for the place where it matters. If you are still listening, please comment below and tell me how satisfied you are with the story so far. It lets me know there are still people walking beside me through this journey. Your presence is my greatest encouragement to keep telling the final part. I thought the video would be what worried my husband most. A few weeks later, during financial discovery, my attorney placed a bank statement in front of me that I had never seen. There was an account in my husband's name that I did not know existed, and money had been disappearing into it for 18 months. After the temporary hearing, life settled into a strange routine. I was still healing, still getting up at night with Grace, still packing lunches and answering client emails when the house was quiet. Most communication with my husband now went through the parenting app. That distance helped. It also gave my attorney room to look closely at the finances. I thought the house would be the biggest issue. Then she showed me the account. For about 18 months, part of my husband's income had been moving into a separate account I never knew existed. There was no single dramatic withdrawal. That was almost worse. The money had been leaving steadily, month after month, like someone had been building another life payment by payment. My attorney turned the statements toward me. Hotel charges, restaurants in neighborhoods he had never taken us to, a jewelry store, rideshare receipts, a recurring payment connected to an apartment across town. Some dates landed on nights I remembered. One was the night he said he had a conference dinner. Another was the night I stayed home with our oldest daughter while she had a fever. Another was the evening I took all 3 girls to a school carnival alone because he said work had run late. My attorney pointed to several lines. Do you recognize these? No. What frightened me was not the amount. It was the dates. Each one pulled an old memory out of place. I had always imagined betrayal, if it happened to me, would arrive loudly, like a door being kicked open. Instead, it came in small print on a bank statement. A date, a charge, a location. Then, suddenly, an entire year of your life means something different. I did not call my husband and demand an explanation. I would have wanted him to explain every charge and tell me I was wrong. I did not need that anymore. I needed something I could verify. My attorney kept following the records. Eventually, one name began appearing beside the expenses. A woman from his office. I had met her once or twice at company events. What I remembered most was my mother-in-law looking at her and saying, "Such a polished young woman." At the time, it meant nothing. Now it did. My attorney slid another page across the table. "The spending matters," she said, "but there's something else I want you to see." It was a timeline. The pattern had not started during my 4th pregnancy. It went back further. Not long after our 3rd daughter was born. The date on that timeline changed the story I had been telling myself. I looked at my attorney and asked the only question that mattered. How long? She told me. The pattern began not long after our 3rd daughter was born. For a moment, I just sat there. That meant my husband had not looked at our 4th baby in the hospital and suddenly decided our marriage was over. He had already been living 2 lives. Another girl had not been the beginning. It had been his final excuse. What hurt most was not simply knowing there had been another woman. It was realizing that while I had spent those years wondering what I was doing wrong, he already knew he was pulling away. He let me keep trying to repair something he had stopped protecting. That kind of lie reaches backward. It does not only change the present, it makes you revisit birthdays, school nights, family dinners, and ordinary mornings. You start asking which memories were real and which ones had another story running underneath them. My attorney was careful with me. She explained that an affair did not automatically give me the house. It did not erase his rights as a father either. But the undisclosed spending could matter financially, and the timeline mattered because it showed how long he had been hiding things while presenting a different story. I nodded. The older version of me would have asked why I was not enough. This time a different question came. Why had I accepted being measured by his standards for so long? The answer did not come all at once. But something in me shifted. I did not call the woman from his office. I did not drive to his workplace. I did not ask him to explain himself. I wanted facts more than excuses. A few days later, my attorney called me back in. During the review of financial messages, they had found a short exchange between my husband and his mother. There were only a few lines. One stopped me. "Nicole is still young. You still have time for the family you wanted." I stared at the timestamp, 3 months before Grace was born, and suddenly, every polite question she had asked during my pregnancy sounded different in my memory. I read the message once, then again, then a third time. The affair hurt, but this was different. My mother-in-law had not simply known about it. She had been waiting for my baby to be a girl. The message stayed with me for days. Not because it proved my mother-in-law knew about the affair, because it showed how she had been thinking about me while I was still carrying Grace. During those final months, she had called to ask about the nursery. She had sat across from me at family dinners. She had asked when the baby was due and whether I needed anything from the store. All the while, she knew her son was building a life somewhere else. And worse, she seemed to believe another woman might give him the family she thought I had failed to provide. Not long after that, I attended a church fundraiser because my oldest daughter had helped with a school project connected to it. I was standing near the refreshment table when I heard my mother-in-law talking to several women. She had one arm around my daughter. "My granddaughters are my whole world," she said. The women smiled at her. There was a time when I would have walked over and exposed everything. I did not. I just watched. That afternoon, I understood something about hypocrisy. People do not always lie because they are trying to fool everyone around them. Sometimes they are protecting the version of themselves that other people are still willing to believe. And I finally saw that her obsession had never been only about having a grandson. It was about deciding who counted, who was successful, who had failed, and who was allowed to belong. A few days later, she called me. She said she hoped I was not planning to use private family messages against her son. I asked one question. "Were they private when you were planning my replacement?" The silence lasted several seconds. Then she said she had only wanted her son to be happy. "You wanted him to get what he wanted," I said. "That isn't the same thing." Then I ended the call. I did not need an apology anymore. I did not need a confession. That was new for me. Sometimes people never admit what they did. Healing does not have to wait for them. The following week, my attorney called. The final hearing had been scheduled. "From now on," she said, "we stop trying to understand them. We prepare." I looked across my kitchen table. The deed, the trust records, the parenting logs, the camera file, the bank statements. All the things my husband had spent years calling paperwork. For more than a decade, he thought I was weak because I did not argue about those things. Now, those quiet pieces of paper were about to enter a courtroom before either of us did. Family court is not much like television. There were no dramatic speeches and no last-minute surprises. Most of the morning was people turning pages, reading dates, and answering questions that sounded almost ordinary. But sometimes ordinary questions are where a life changes. My attorney started with the house. She walked through my father's trust, the source of the purchase money, the closing records, and the deed. The funds could be traced. There had never been a mortgage in my husband's name, and the title matched the records we had kept for years. By the time that part ended, the court treated the house as my separate property, and then the focus moved to the girls. The judge looked at where they had been living, their school, their pediatrician, their daily routines, and who had handled most of their care before the divorce began. The hospital records mattered. So did the school pickup report. So did the foyer video and the messages that came afterward. The affair was not the center of that decision. The question was stability, and what arrangement served the girls best. Their primary residence remained with me. My husband received structured parenting time. Communication would continue through the parenting system, and neither side could use relatives to make sudden pickup changes outside the agreed rules. Then came the finances. The record showed his actual income and the money that had been spent outside our household. Those expenses were considered as the financial issues were sorted out. Child support was based on income, the parenting arrangement, and the needs of 4 children. Not punishment, responsibility. When the decisions were read, there was no cheering and no sense of revenge. My husband kept his eyes on the table. Months earlier, that would have hurt me. I would have wanted him to look at me and finally understand what he had done. That morning, I did not need him to. I had once imagined justice would feel like winning. It did not. It felt lighter than that. Maybe real justice is not always about making another person suffer. Sometimes it is simply the point where they no longer have the power to keep hurting you. Outside the courthouse, the air was cold. My attorney asked how I felt. I looked down at the house key resting in my palm. Tired. She smiled a little. I closed my fingers around the key. But I think I'm finally going home. A year later, home sounded different. One afternoon, I sat on the front porch while the girls spread out around me. My oldest was doing homework. My second had a book across her knees. My third was drawing flowers in chalk on the driveway. Grace was learning to walk. She would take a few steps, fall, and push herself back up. The house was not perfect, but it was peaceful. My bookkeeping business had become steady work, reliable clients, regular income, and choices. I could pay the bills, care for the girls, and turn down work when life was full. Most important, I never again had to stay because I was afraid I could not survive on my own. Their father still saw the girls on scheduled parenting time. I never taught them to hate him, and I did not lie to protect him either. When they are old enough, they will know the truth in ways they can understand. The relationship he started during our marriage did not last long after everything came into the open. I heard that once, then let it go. My mother-in-law eventually asked to see the girls. I allowed visits with boundaries. She had to call first. There would be no comments about boys, family names, or one child being worth more than another. If those boundaries were crossed, the visits would stop. Forgiveness is not the same as giving someone control again. Sometimes I still hear the words my husband used that day, "Take your daughters." He had said daughters like it was an insult. I did take my daughters. I took them forward with me. For years, I thought I needed to be a good wife, give him the child he wanted, earn his mother's approval, and prove my work mattered. Now I understand that no court gave me my value, no house gave it to me. No bank account did either. Those things protected my choices. My worth was already there. I once thought the 4 words, "The house is mine," had saved me. Looking back, the house only gave me somewhere to stand long enough to see the truth. What saved me was understanding that no one else had the right to decide what I was worth. Do you think I handled my husband and his mother the right way, or would you have done something differently? And most of all, were you satisfied with how this story ended?